The school looked smaller than Evan remembered. The hallways, once filled with noise and motion, now stood quiet and still as the end-of-day bell echoed into silence. Years ago, he had walked these corridors as a student, backpack slung over one shoulder, books clutched to his chest, always in a rush. But now, returning as a student teacher, he moved slower, more cautiously. The weight on his shoulders was different. He wasn't a teenager anymore. He was here to learn in a different way. His shoes clicked against the tile floor as he made his way toward the faculty room. Everything looked the same, yet slightly different. The lockers were the same, dull blue. The faded posters on the walls still preached the importance of attendance and effort. But Evan felt like a stranger to it all, like someone walking through the echo of his own memory. He had been assigned to assist in the literature department, shadowing one of the senior teachers for the semester, Mr. Marco Bellamy. The name had sounded vaguely familiar when Evan first read it in the assignment email. Now, as he stood outside the classroom marked with that name, he tried to recall if they had ever met before. He doubted it. Evan had never been much of a literature kid. Science and math had been his lanes, but something about literature had started calling to him during his university years. Maybe it was the search for something deeper, something human. When he finally stepped inside the classroom, Marco was already there. He looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable at first. A man in his mid-30s, with neatly combed dark hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and a calm, observant demeanor. He wasn't particularly tall or broad, but something about him, perhaps the quiet control he carried, filled the room. He greeted Evan with a professional courtesy, his words measured and polite. There was no awkward handshake or warm smile, just a nod and a suggestion to take a seat. Evan complied, taking the chair next to the shelves lined with books. From his position, he could see the organized chaos on Marco's desk. Neatly stacked papers, a ceramic mug half filled with cold coffee, a fountain pen laid precisely across a leather-bound notebook. The day passed slowly, filled with lesson observation and note-taking. Marco moved through his lectures with ease, his voice steady, his explanations clear. He wasn't flashy or overly animated, but he had a way of holding attention. Students listened, even if some pretended not to. Evan found himself drawn to the way Marco explained things. There was thought behind each sentence, as if he weighed every word before speaking aloud. After the last bell rang and the students filtered out, Evan remained behind to review the lesson plan for the next day. Marco stayed at his desk, flipping through a stack of essays, his pen occasionally scratching across the page. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was dense, filled with everything they were not yet saying. Outside the windows, the sky had already begun to shift into shades of blue and gold. The autumn air made the room feel slightly cooler, and Evan pulled his sleeves down, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Being back in this place brought out emotions he hadn't expected. He thought it would be simple, observe, assist, learn, but already something about this space, this man was beginning to stir things he didn't want to name. He caught himself watching Marco's hands as he graded, steady, precise, with a kind of grace that came from years of repetition. His sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal his forearms, marked faintly with ink from earlier writing. Evan looked away quickly, embarrassed by the direction of his thoughts. He reminded himself of his purpose. This was a professional setting. He was here to gain experience, not to get distracted by impossible curiosities. Still, his chest tightened slightly as he glanced once more toward the man who, without trying, had unsettled something inside him. Marco finally looked up, giving a small nod of approval. He pointed toward the lesson outline, his finger tracing the lines of poetry they'd review next. Evan leaned in slightly, listening, nodding, taking mental notes. As Marco explained the structure of metaphor, Evan found himself thinking less about the lesson and more about the sound of his voice. Measured, calm, confident. It was a voice that could explain anything and make it seem important. That night, when Evan returned home, he felt a strange restlessness. The walls of his apartment felt closer than usual, the quiet too quiet. He replayed small moments from the day, Marco adjusting his glasses, the sound of chalk against the board, the way his eyes lingered on a sentence before deciding how to respond. None of it meant anything, and yet it meant something. Evan couldn't name the feeling exactly. It wasn't attraction in the typical sense. It was curiosity, admiration, a kind of ache he hadn't felt in years, an ache that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being seen. And for a brief second, sitting alone at his kitchen table with his notes spread out before him, he wondered what Marco saw when he looked back. The following week passed in a blur of classrooms, lesson plans, and quiet observations. Evan kept to his schedule, arriving early, staying late, scribbling notes in the margins of his planner with a focus that felt both purposeful and distracting. He was try to learn, try to stay professional, try to ignore the flicker of something unnamed that seemed to stir every time Marco walked into a room. On Thursday, the school hosted its first meeting of the after-school literary circle. A few students had signed up, most of them quiet types who hovered in the margins of the classroom. Marco had asked Evan to help coordinate the sessions, suggesting it would be a good way to engage with the students more directly. Evan had agreed without hesitation, eager for more hands-on involvement, and, if he were honest with himself, eager for more time in Marco's presence. They spent the afternoon preparing materials in the resource room. Stacks of poetry books and printed discussion prompts filled the table. Marco moved through the space with a quiet efficiency, his attention divided between the logistics and the soft hum of a classical piano piece playing from the speakers. Evan worked beside him, folding handouts and alphabetizing name tags, occasionally sneaking glances at the older man's focused expression. There was something grounding in the rhythm of the preparation. The air was still, scented faintly with old paper and fresh coffee. No students, no noise, just the quiet exchange of tasks between two people with a shared goal. For a while, Evan managed to lose himself in the work, the edge of his tension softening. When the students arrived, Marco opened the session with a simple welcome and handed the lead to Evan. It was a small group, 6 students, a mix of juniors and seniors, each with a different reason for being there. Some were clearly passionate about writing, others just curious, and 1 or 2 possibly there out of boredom. Evan introduced the day's theme, identity in literature, and guided them through a short story discussion with a steady voice and open questions. Marco sat in the back, observing silently, occasionally jotting down notes. Evan could feel his presence like gravity, an invisible force that somehow calmed him and made him more self-aware all at once. He was careful not to look over too often, but he sensed the way Marco's eyes followed him. Not critically, just attentively, like he was watching someone discover something they didn't yet realize about themselves. As the session progressed, the students grew more animated, and Evan felt something unlock inside him. It wasn't just about teaching. It was about connection, about making space for others to express something real, and in doing so, feeling a little more real himself. His words came easier, his movements more fluid, and when laughter broke out over a shared joke in the text, he found himself smiling without thinking. After the meeting, the students thanked him and filtered out slowly, their voices trailing down the hallway. Marco stood near the bookshelves, arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face. Evan began tidying up, collecting papers, and organizing chairs, trying not to appear too eager for feedback. Marco eventually stepped forward, picking up a strained notebook and placing it neatly on the desk. His comment was simple, something about how natural Evan seemed with the group, how his presence drew the students in without overpowering them. Evan felt the praise settle in his chest, warm and unfamiliar. They walked out of the classroom together as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting amber light through the tall windows. The hallway was mostly empty, quiet except for the distant sound of janitorial carts rolling down another corridor. Their steps echoed softly on the linoleum as they moved toward the exit. Outside, the parking lot was bathed in golden light. The trees at the edge of the lot rustled gently in the breeze, their leaves already tinged with autumn. Marco paused near his car, keys in hand, and glanced up at the sky as if considering something he wasn't quite ready to say aloud. Evan stood beside him, arms folded across his chest, unsure whether to say goodbye or linger. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was weighted, as though both men were listening to something invisible and unspoken. Eventually, Marco gave a small nod, not quite a farewell, but an acknowledgement of something shared. Evan returned the gesture, and they parted without words. That night, Evan found himself thinking less about the students and more about the way Marco's voice had sounded when he praised him. Soft, measured, but sincere. He replayed the moment in the hallway, the quiet understanding in their final glance, and wondered if he was imagining the connection that seemed to pulse beneath every interaction. It wasn't romantic, he told himself. It didn't have to be, but there was something there, something deeper than admiration, quieter than desire, a kind of recognition, as if two people had found a piece of themselves reflected in the other and didn't quite know what to do with it. By the time October reached its halfway mark, the air had grown colder, and the light outside the school windows carried that unmistakable golden hue of fall. The building creaked more often now, as if it too was adjusting to the seasonal shift. Evan had started to feel more at home in the routine, more sure of his place in the classroom and among the staff. But no matter how comfortable things became on the surface, something beneath it all stirred constantly. Unsettled, quiet, persistent. It was the kind of restlessness that came not from stress or uncertainty, but from anticipation. A subtle current that ran underneath every interaction, especially the ones with Marco. The literary sessions had grown more popular, and Evan now spent most afternoons staying late, organizing materials, refining discussion points, or simply sitting in silence across the room while Marco graded papers. These quiet moments stretched longer with each passing day. Words became less necessary. Stillness, it seemed, held more meaning than conversation ever could. One Friday, the halls emptied faster than usual. Students vanished in waves of laughter and backpacks, disappearing into the weekend. Evan remained behind to tidy up. Marco was still at his desk, half lost in a stack of essays, the room bathed in the dimming afternoon light. The fan hummed overhead, the only sound beside the occasional rustle of paper. It was in that silence that Evan realized how different everything felt compared to his first day back. He sat at one of the student desks, flipping through a book they had discussed earlier that week. His eyes skimmed the pages, but he wasn't reading. Not really. His mind drifted to the sound of Marco's pen, the curve of his handwriting, the subtle way he furrowed his brow when concentrating. Evan wasn't sure when admiration had shifted into something more complicated, more intense. It hadn't happened all at once. It had crept in gradually, through shared glances, a brief smile over coffee, a discussion about poetry that had ended with both of them sitting in reflective silence. He had started to notice the warmth in Marco's eyes, the softness in his voice when he was caught off guard. And once he noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of lavender. The day was ending, but neither of them moved. The silence thickened. Marco leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling for a moment before landing on Evan. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a quiet shift in atmosphere, like the final inhale before breath is held. When Marco stood and stretched, the scrape of his chair against the floor startled Evan out of his thoughts. He glanced up, his chest tight with an emotion he didn't know how to name. Marco crossed the room slowly and paused by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the sky fade. Evan remained in his seat, unsure whether to speak or just sit in the moment. He watched Marco's reflection in the window, the soft line of his profile silhouetted against the dimming light. It was a scene that didn't need words, just the awareness that they were both there, suspended in the same stillness. Eventually, Marco turned, his expression unreadable but calm. He didn't say anything, only nodded slightly in Evan's direction as he walked back toward his desk. Evan felt the nod settle in his chest like a whisper, the kind of gesture that said everything without saying anything. He stood, gathering his things with hands that felt clumsy and slow. The silence had changed, no longer comfortable, now almost unbearable. As he moved toward the door, he hesitated. Something inside him resisted leaving. He turned slightly, just enough to see Marco still seated, eyes lowered but clearly aware of his presence. In that moment, a silent conversation passed between them. Nothing was said aloud, but everything was understood. There was a gravity between them now, subtle but undeniable. A pull that neither had dared to acknowledge directly, yet both had felt for some time. Evan stepped into the hallway, the door clicking softly behind him. The corridor was empty, the lights overhead casting long shadows on the floor. His footsteps echoed louder than usual, as if the building itself was reacting to his presence. He made it halfway down the hall before stopping, his hand brushing the cool surface of the lockers as he took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was waiting for, an answer, a sign, a reason to turn back. But the truth was, he didn't want to walk away. Not yet. Not without knowing if he was alone and feeling what he felt. Eventually, he found himself outside, the air crisp and biting at his skin. The parking lot was nearly deserted. The wind stirred the trees and sent a few leaves tumbling across the asphalt. Evan stood still, his bag slung over his shoulder, and looked back toward the building. Somewhere inside, Marco was likely still at his desk, unaware of the storm Evan was trying to contain. That night, sleep came late. Evan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled and wild. He replayed the day in fragments, the silence, the glances, the absence of words that said so much more than spoken ones ever could. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something real and raw and fragile. And yet, despite the confusion, there was also clarity. He was falling, quietly, steadily, and with a kind of grace he hadn't expected. Evan was falling for a man who didn't need to say a word to make him feel seen. The days that followed felt longer than usual. The clocks ticked louder, the lessons dragged on, and Evan found himself avoiding the quiet. He filled his time with errands, extra grading, conversations with other teachers, anything to stay occupied, anything to avoid being alone with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. Something had shifted after that Friday. It hadn't been dramatic, but it had been unmistakable. A silence that was once comfortable had begun to feel strained. The closeness that once brought warmth now came with tension. Evan couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, only that it had, and that it scared him. He started arriving at school later, just in time for the first bell. His afternoons, once lingering and unrushed, now ended quickly. He left the classroom before Marco could ask him to stay, before he could look too long or wait too much. Evan wasn't angry, not really, but the weight of uncertainty sat heavy in his chest, and it was easier to keep moving than to stop and feel it fully. Each time they crossed paths, he noticed the pauses, the small hesitations in Marco's voice, the way his eyes searched Evan's face just a second longer than necessary. These moments felt fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a table, ready to fall but never quite tipping. During one of the literary sessions, the atmosphere felt different. The students seemed louder, more restless, and the room buzzed with a different kind of energy. Evan led the group as usual, but his voice was a little flatter, his enthusiasm slightly dimmed. Marco, seated in the back, remained unusually quiet. He didn't offer suggestions or feedback. He simply watched. When the students left, Evan pretended to be busy. He gathered papers that didn't need organizing, wiped down desks that weren't dirty. Marco stayed for a moment, as if waiting for a reason to speak, then left without a word. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the empty room. Evan stood still, his hands resting on the edge of a desk, trying to steady his breath. He felt like he was losing something he never fully had, something that had never been promised but had grown, silently, in the spaces between them. The confusion wasn't just about Marco. It was also about himself. Evan had never been in love. He'd had crushes, moments of affection, fleeting interest. But this was different. It was steady and soft, not loud or impulsive. It was rooted in something deeper than appearance or attention. It was the way Marco spoke about poetry, the way he listened without judgment, the way his presence made Evan feel grounded and seen. And that's what made it so terrifying. Because Evan didn't know if Marco felt it too. Or if he did, whether he was also afraid of it. Maybe that was why the silence had grown heavier. Maybe they were both retreating into safety, unsure how to step forward without falling. One evening, as Evan walked home through the quiet streets, he noticed the trees shedding more leaves. The sidewalks were littered with amber and crimson, the air crisp enough to sting his cheeks. He pulled his scarf tighter, his thoughts looping endlessly as he retraced the steps of the past few weeks. He thought of the moments that had pulled him in, the stillness after the bell, the glance in the window, the small nods that had said so much. And yet, none of them had been followed by words. Words that could clarify, confirm, or even end the uncertainty. That night, he wrote in his notebook something he hadn't done in years. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and unpolished. But eventually, they began to take shape. Lines about silence, about restraint, about what it meant to feel deeply and speak softly. He didn't name Marco. He didn't have to. The act of writing felt like breathing for the first time in days. The next morning, Evan arrived early again. He didn't plan to. His feet just took him there, as if his body had made the decision before his mind could argue. The classroom was still dark when he entered, the lights flickering on with a soft hum. He sat at his desk, his notebook in front of him, and waited. Marco arrived a few minutes later, pausing when he saw Evan already inside. Their eyes met briefly. There was a moment, short, silent, when neither of them moved. Then Marco nodded, his expression unreadable, and walked to his desk. The morning passed quietly, but the air between them had changed once more. Not lighter, but clearer, as if both of them had acknowledged the space, the silence, and the need to step into it rather than around it. Evan didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in days, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be afraid of finding out. The last week of October arrived quietly. The school halls, once filled with scattered energy, had begun to settle into the rhythm of autumn. The excitement of the new term had worn off, replaced by the calm efficiency of routine. But for Evan, everything still felt slightly off-center, like he was walking through familiar rooms in someone else's dream. He had stopped avoiding Marco. Not entirely, at least. Their interactions were still careful, measured, but the tension between them no longer felt like a wall. It was more like a current, present, undeniable, but no longer something either of them pretended not to feel. One late afternoon, after the last class had ended and the halls had emptied, Evan lingered near the windows of the second floor. Outside, the sky had turned pale and colorless, the way it often did before dusk. He watched as leaves were carried across the parking lot by the wind, their movement unpredictable, almost aimless. There was something oddly comforting about it. Footsteps echoed behind him, familiar ones. Marco entered the hallway, his pace unhurried. He stopped a short distance away, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to disappear. Evan didn't turn immediately. He kept his eyes on the trees outside, the soft rustling of branches barely audible through the glass. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of unspoken things that were finally ready to be heard. When Evan turned, their eyes met. It was the kind of glance that didn't ask questions, but held space for answers. They didn't speak. Instead, they simply stood there, two people who had spent weeks circling around a truth they didn't know how to name. Eventually, Marco gestured toward the stairwell with a quiet, unspoken invitation. Evan followed. They walked in step down the stairs, past the trophy cases and the faded motivational posters, until they reached the side door that led to the courtyard. The cold air met them immediately, crisp and refreshing. The courtyard was empty, a patch of grass and benches nestled between two wings of the school. Evan had always found it peaceful. Today it felt sacred. They sat side by side on a worn wooden bench, the space between them small but deliberate. The wind moved through the trees above, scattering a few leaves at their feet. Evan glanced down, his hands resting in his lap, fingers intertwined. Marco leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on a gravel path ahead. The posture was relaxed, but his shoulders held a quiet tension. Still, he didn't speak, and neither did Evan. They simply let the moment breathe. It was Marco who moved first, not dramatically, but gently. One hand shifted, slow and cautious, until it rested palm up on the bench between them. A quiet offer. A beginning. Evan looked down at the gesture, his breath caught somewhere between fear and relief. He didn't rush. He didn't even move right away. He just stared at the space between their hands and let the weight of it settle. Then, slowly, he placed his fingers over Marco's. No grasp, no pressure. Just touch. Just contact. A connection as soft and quiet as everything they had been building between them. The wind passed again, colder this time. Evan's other hand moved to zip up his jacket, but he didn't let go. In that stillness, there were no declarations. No promises. Just presence. Two people sitting in the cold, hands lightly touching, hearts trying to steady themselves beneath layers of restraint and reason. It wasn't a love story. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way stories are typically told. But it was something real. Something built from shared silences and long glances and the unspoken understanding that some connections defy definition. As the sun dipped behind the building and the shadows grew longer, they remained on the bench. Not speaking, not rushing, just being. And for Evan, that was enough. Because the real beginning wasn't the moment they met, or even the moment they had finally acknowledged each other. It was this, the willingness to stay in the quiet together. To listen when there were no words. To let something gentle and fragile live, even when the world outside demanded clarity and labels. That was the first step, and Evan took it with open eyes, a quiet heart, and the knowledge that some moments don't need to be defined to matter.